Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Cold Case Christianity from my atheist perspective. In this video, we will begin section 2 of the book, which is titled Examine the Evidence, and we will be looking at chapter 11, which is titled Were They Present? So let's get started with that chapter, shall we? Now that we've sort of learned to be detectives by going through the first half of the book, it's time to apply what we've learned and focus our newly gained detective skills on examining the Gospels to determine if they're reliable. Wallace tells us that it was an investigation like this one that he's about to lead us through that actually converted him from atheism to Christianity. So let's see what happens when we go through it. You know, you never know. Wallace begins his investigation here by examining how late the Gospels were written. If the Gospels were written too late, he reasons, then they aren't worth very much as historical sources, because if they were written too late, then the eyewitnesses to Jesus and the events depicted in the Gospels would have been dead, and therefore the Gospels couldn't have been based on direct first-generation, legitimate eyewitness testimony. And he shares an anecdote from his detective career about a witness who came forward a year after a crime they were investigating had been committed, offering a completely different version of the events that exonerated one of the suspects. And it turned out that this belated witness was actually a relative of one of the suspects, and her testimony was, as Wallace puts it, a piece of late fiction. So too were the Gospels, Wallace says, if they were written much later than the life of Jesus. And that is what Wallace says he once believed. Quote, "As a skeptic, I believed that the Gospels were penned in the 2nd century and were similarly worthless. If they were written that late, they were not eyewitness accounts. It's really as simple as that. True eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus would have lived and written in the 1st century. The first criterion of eyewitness reliability requires us to answer the question, were the alleged eyewitnesses present in the first place? But were the Gospels really written that late? Well, Wallace lays out what he characterizes as a compelling circumstantial case for the Gospels being written much earlier, much closer to the lifetime of Jesus. The New Testament, for instance, and this is the first plank in his circumstantial case, the New Testament makes no reference to the siege of Jerusalem or to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And since the temple was destroyed in AD 70, Wallace reasons, the Gospels must have been written earlier than that, because surely if the Gospels had been written after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, they would have made reference to this very important event in those days. Well, actually, the Gospels do reference the destruction of the temple in the form of Jesus predicting the fall of the temple in both the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Now, Wallace notes this, though he only specifically references the passage from Matthew, which is odd since the corresponding passage from Mark is nearly identical and was probably written before that passage in Matthew, since Matthew used Mark as one of his sources. But anyway, Wallace mentions it and just considers it one of the fulfilled prophecies of Jesus, ignoring the much more likely possibility that the text was written after the events that Jesus was depicted as predicting. Now, it's interesting that Wallace specifically mentions not just the destruction of the temple, but also the siege of Jerusalem, of which the destruction of the temple was the culmination. I've repeatedly seen scholars propose the siege as an explanation for why no original documents from the early Christian church survive. At the earliest, we have maybe 3rd-generation copies of the Gospels and the other books of the New Testament. We have no 1st-generation copies, and one of the reasons that I've often heard proposed for this is the siege of Jerusalem, where the original records were destroyed or were lost in some other way. The siege included fires that destroyed Jewish records and caused Christians to flee the city. And the fact that few, if any, Christians were actually present in Jerusalem for the siege or for the destruction of the temple might also explain why those events don't occupy a prominent place in the Gospels or in the rest of the New Testament. Luke doesn't mention the deaths of Peter, Paul, or James, all of which occurred before AD 60 to about 68. This is another reason that Wallace says the Gospels should be considered as having been written earlier than the 2nd century. And because Luke doesn't mention the deaths of Peter, Paul, or James, that means that the Gospel of Luke must have been written before they died. Again, we're talking the years 60 to 68, so before that. And since the same author wrote Luke and Acts, the Gospel of Luke would have been written prior to the book of Acts. Well, the fact that Luke makes no mention of the deaths of Peter, Paul, or James doesn't necessarily mean that the book of Luke was written before they died. The Gospel of John makes no explicit mention of any of their deaths either. There is one passage that seems to allude to the crucifixion of Peter, and which may be a prediction after the fact, similar to Jesus's quote-unquote predictions about the destruction of the temple in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. And John was one of the last Gospels written. Incidentally, in his discussion of when the Gospels were written and trying to establish them as having been written early, in this chapter, Wallace makes almost no reference to the Gospel of John at all. The Gospel of John was, according to the scholarly consensus, was written much later than the Synoptic Gospels. It was probably written in around the year 90 or even in the year 100 or as far out as 110. So it was written much later. And it makes no explicit reference to the deaths of Peter or Paul or James. That doesn't mean that it had to have been written earlier. We know that the Gospel of John was written much later, and it still makes no reference to those deaths or to the siege of Jerusalem or the fall of the temple. The evidence most often asserted for an early authorship of Luke is that the author was Luke, the companion of Paul. But modern scholars now tend to reject this notion, and they date the composition of Luke and Acts to closer to the time that the Gospel of John was written, around the late 1st or early 2nd century. The next piece of circumstantial evidence that Wallace considers for an early composition of the Gospels is the fact that Paul quotes the Gospel of Luke and refers to it as scripture in the first epistle to Timothy. 1 Timothy is one of the disputed works of Paul. It's very likely that Paul didn't actually write it, and in fact that it originated much later than is traditionally thought by the church, and much later than the genuine epistles written by Paul. Now, to his credit, Wallace acknowledges this, although he then quickly waves it off, claiming that the majority of scholars recognize an early date for Timothy, for 1 Timothy. Now, I don't have the exact percentages for you, but my impression has been exactly the opposite, that the modern scholarly consensus for some time has been that 1 Timothy was not written by Paul and that it originated much later than the legitimate Pauline epistles. Next, Wallace makes the related argument that Paul echoed the Gospels in his writings, and since Paul died sometime before the year AD 68, then the Gospels must have already been written and in circulation long before that for Paul to be able to reference them and call them scripture in his letters. Well, why should we assume that Paul is echoing the Gospels rather than assume the opposite, that the Gospels are echoing Paul? Wallace seems to believe that whenever Paul and one of the Gospel writers agree with each other or use similar language, that it's Paul echoing the Gospels. But the genuine writings of Paul, the ones that the biblical scholarly consensus agree were genuinely written by Paul, are the earliest surviving Christian documents that we have. We know with as much certainty as we can have about such things that the authentic Pauline epistles were written between the years AD 50 and 57, thereabouts. So when Paul refers to something that we also find in the Gospels, doesn't it make more sense to assume that Paul, who we know was writing sometime in the 50s, came along first, and that the Gospels were composed later and are echoing him? Wallace is assuming an early date for the Gospels, and then he's using the date of Paul and the assumption that the Gospels came first as evidence for the early date for the Gospels. But there's no reason to assume that the Gospels came first, and there's lots of reasons to believe that they came later and that their composition and their inclusion in the New Testament canon was greatly influenced by Paul, by the ideas of Paul, and by the followers of Paul. Here's just an example. Wallace mentions that in both the writings of Paul in 1 Corinthians, which is one of the genuine Pauline epistles, and the book of Luke, there are descriptions of the Last Supper. And I'll get back to this a little bit later because there's something really interesting going on here. But they both reference the Last Supper, and they both describe it in very, very similar ways. The two descriptions are similar right down to the words attributed to Jesus. And on that subject, Wallace says this, quote, Paul appears to be quoting Luke's gospel, the only gospel that has Jesus saying that the disciples are to do this in remembrance of me. If Paul is trying to use a description of the meal that was already well known at the time, this account must have been circulating for a period of time prior to Paul's letter. Now just remember that for a little bit later. On the subject at hand, is Paul quoting Luke, or is Luke quoting or lifting from Paul? Well, as I said, isn't it more likely that the story of the Last Supper was in circulation in some earlier form prior to Paul's letter, and that the phrase on which Wallace places so much emphasis, do this in remembrance of me, appeared first in Paul and then was picked up later by the author of Luke? That makes sense, and it fits with the modern scholarly consensus that Luke and Acts were written perhaps several decades after the death of Paul. Next, Luke quotes from Mark and Matthew extensively, which means Mark and Matthew must have come first. Wallace acknowledges that substantial portions of Luke seem to have been copied or quoted, as Wallace puts it, from the Gospel of Mark. He says, quote, It's reasonable, therefore, to conclude that Mark's account was already recognized, accepted, and available to Luke prior to his authorship of the Gospel. And I agree with him on this. And I think so do most modern biblical scholars. If you look up the date when the Gospel of Mark was written, the consensus seems to be that it was written around AD 70. At least it originated around AD 70. And it may have been added to and edited after that. It's generally agreed that Mark is the earliest gospel, and that it was a major source for both Matthew and Luke. But I don't see how this helps Wallace's argument. If he's saying that Mark must have been written before Luke and Matthew, and that Luke and Matthew both used Mark as a source, then he's not disagreeing with the modern scholarly consensus. But the modern scholarly consensus says that the earliest of the Gospels wasn't written before the year 70. Or at least not too far before the year 70, which means his earlier claim that Paul was referencing the Gospels when he wrote his epistles can't possibly be true. The next bit of evidence that Wallace presents is that the Gospel of Mark is briefer and more urgent than the other Gospels, which suggests that it was written earlier. Wallace likens Mark to a crime report containing just the most important details, while Matthew and Luke are more like the later final reports on the events, containing more complete accounts. And again, what Wallace says doesn't really contradict the scholarly consensus, other than his insistence that Mark and the other Gospels were written before the Pauline epistles. If we assume that the two-source hypothesis is true, then Mark was written prior to the other Gospels, and was itself probably based on earlier, more scattered sources. And viewed in that light, it makes sense that Mark is shorter and, as Wallace puts it, less ordered than the later Gospels, which were largely rewrites and embellishments of Mark. Wallace makes another argument for Mark coming before the other Gospels, which, again, I don't dispute. I just dispute how early he says it was written. So, if Wallace doesn't accept that the Gospels were written post AD 70, when does he think they were written? Well, by taking into account all his biased assumptions, or what he calls circumstantial evidence, he proposes that Mark was written between AD 45 and 50, followed a few years later by Luke's Gospel, followed by the letters of Paul, which reference, according to Wallace, reference Luke, and then last of all, Wallace places the writing of Acts between AD 57 and 60, which is a full 10 years earlier than the scholarly consensus dating of Mark, the earliest gospel. Wallace says, quote, "While skeptics would like to claim that the Gospels were written well after the alleged life of the apostles and much closer to the councils that affirmed them, the evidence indicates something quite different." Well, no, it doesn't. Wallace isn't talking about evidence. He's talking about a series of assumptions. Most importantly, the assumption that the Gospels were written before the Pauline epistles, and that the lack of explicit references to the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple and the deaths of Peter and Paul and James means that the Gospels must have been written before approximately AD 60. Those assumptions shape Wallace's explanation of when the various documents of the New Testament originated and which ones came first and which ones came later. It's worth saying again that not all skeptics think that the Gospels were written well after the lives of the apostles. If Mark, was written circa 70, that's still fairly early. Yes, it's 40 years after the life of Jesus, but it's also decades earlier than the probable origination dates of Luke and John, for instance. And that's just the Gospels. The Pauline epistles, the genuine ones that Paul probably actually wrote, were even earlier than Mark. They originated circa 50 to 57. Wallace wants everything, particularly the Gospels, to be earlier still, but it's not as if in order to reject the core claims of Christianity, you must establish that the Gospels weren't written until the 2nd century. Now, many people do make that argument, but it's not necessary to believe and to establish that the Gospels weren't written until sometime after the year AD 100 in order to reject them as legitimate historical sources. And it's also worth mentioning that not everyone who disagrees with Wallace's dates is an atheist. Most of the scholars who constitute that scholarly consensus I've been referring to are Christians. The modern field of biblical criticism, which includes the documentary hypothesis, the two-source hypothesis, form criticism, the dating of the origins of the various books of the New Testament, almost all of that is the product of Christian critics and theologians. They haven't rejected Christianity. They've just decided that the version of the faith propagated by conservative evangelicals like Wallace doesn't fit with the facts. Anyway, let's pretend that Wallace's circumstantial case for the early authorship of the Gospels is as strong as he thinks it is. If that's so, why do people still deny an early origin for the Gospels? Well, Wallace has a few ideas. For instance, one reason might be that the Gospels were anonymously authored, and if they weren't actually written by the traditional authors, why should we assume they're based on eyewitness accounts? Well, Wallace argues that just because the Gospels are, strictly speaking, anonymous, that doesn't mean that they have been incorrectly attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As an example, he cites the Annals of Tacitus, which is another ancient document that, strictly speaking, is anonymous, but is nonetheless attributed to Tacitus without controversy. Plus, the traditional authors are the only authors to which the Gospels have ever been attributed. Wallace says, quote, "It's not as if the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John have been discovered in some ancient collection under someone else's name. No early church leader has ever attributed these Gospels to anyone other than Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John. There is no alternative ancient tradition that claims, for example, that the Gospel of Mark is actually written by anyone other than Mark." Well, Wallace weights the fact that the traditional authors are the only proposed authors for the Gospels very heavily. In doing so, he ignores other evidence against the traditional authorship. For instance, while it's true that the Gospel of Mark has never been attributed to an author other than Mark, it's also true that there is evidence in the text that Mark was written by at least two authors who were probably writing decades apart. Wallace also fails to mention that the traditional authors weren't necessarily attached to the Gospels right away. In the case of Mark, the earliest surviving reference attributing that Gospel to Mark comes from Eusebius in the 4th century, who is quoting Papias from the 2nd century. So it's not as though we have traditions going all the way back to the origins of the Gospels that attribute them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The attributions may have come much later. Another reason for skepticism, Wallace suggests, is Jesus' recorded prediction of the destruction of the temple. And on this subject he says, quote, "While the absence of any description of the temple's destruction can reasonably be interpreted as a piece of circumstantial evidence supporting the early dating of the New Testament accounts, skeptics sometimes use this fact to make just the opposite case. Many have proposed that Jesus' prediction related to the destruction was inserted to legitimize the text and make it appear that he had some prophetic power. Hey, I did that. I did." Wallace has this to say about why folks such as myself might interpret Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the temple as not a prediction but a post-diction inserted into the text after the fact. Quote, "This sort of skepticism is clearly rooted in the presupposition we described in Chapter 1. If we begin from a position of philosophical naturalism, the presumption that nothing supernatural is possible, we have no choice but to describe the supernatural elements we find in the Gospels as lies. From a naturalistic perspective, prophetic claims are impossible." Well, I already discussed philosophical naturalism in this series, so I won't go into that again in very much detail here. I'll just reiterate that philosophical naturalism isn't necessarily a dogmatic position. Most people I know, including myself, who either identify or could be fairly described as philosophical naturalists, have come to their positions not because they hold an a priori assumption that the supernatural is impossible, but because they see no evidence for the supernatural and therefore see no reason to take proposed supernatural explanations seriously. Our naturalism is empirical, not dogmatic. But let's just leave that discussion aside, because I don't think it really matters whether one believes that supernatural, in this case prophetic, claims are possible or not. The fact remains there is ample evidence to suggest that the Gospels, with the possible exception of Mark, weren't written until long after the destruction of the temple, which makes the post-diction explanation of Jesus' prophecy more plausible than Jesus actually predicting the destruction of the temple 40 years before it happened. Wallace also chalks up rejection of the New Testament's depiction of miraculous events to an a priori bias against the supernatural. And Wallace is quite keen to insist that we must not reject claims of the supernatural out of hand due to a philosophical bias. I, for one, would be happy to consider any miracle claim for which I could be shown the slightest bit of substantiating evidence. Wallace has none. What he has are 2,000-year-old claims that miracles took place and a clever excuse for why we shouldn't dismiss those claims. He has no positive evidence compelling us to accept those claims, and neither does anyone else that I have ever come across. Now, there's also the references in Luke and Acts to a person named Theophilus that might cause people to be skeptical about an early origin for the Gospels. Some skeptics claim that the Theophilus, which the author of Luke and Acts refers to, is the 2nd century bishop of Antioch, named Theophilus. Wallace argues that the Theophilus that the author of Luke Acts addresses is most likely a Roman official, or possibly Theophilus ben Ananus, who was the high priest of the Jerusalem temple from the years AD 37 to 41, which would put it in a much earlier date. My understanding of the dating of Luke Acts is that the best reasons for dating Luke and Acts later than Wallace does are found not in the references to Theophilus, but in the discrepancies between those books and the genuine Pauline epistles. One of those, that aforementioned description of the Last Supper, also works against Wallace's argument that the Gospels must have been in circulation before Paul wrote his letters. In 1 Corinthians 11:23, Paul seems to be saying that he learned of the Last Supper via a vision from Jesus and then told others about it. But the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all depict the Last Supper, which means, if Wallace is correct, the story of the Last Supper would have been well known to the people to whom Paul was writing, and also to Paul himself. So why would Paul claim that he was the source of the Last Supper story after receiving it in a vision? I want to spend a little bit more time on this. I want to read you the actual passage. I don't actually have this in my script to do, but I find this really interesting, and I think it's an example of Wallace's own argument and his own reasoning sort of coming back to bite him in the ass. So the reference in question is in the first epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 11, starting at verse 23. And here is what Paul says. And this is the, if we go by the scholarly consensus and date the genuine Pauline epistles as the earliest New Testament documents, then this is the earliest reference that we have to the Last Supper. And it goes like this. For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup, when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament, in my blood. This do ye as oft as ye drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, ye do show the Lord's death till he come. Now, Paul clearly says, to my reading, clearly says that this came to him in a vision. He doesn't say this is the story that we all know from the Gospels. He doesn't say you all know about the Last Supper, everybody knows about the Last Supper, Luke writes about the Last Supper, Matthew writes about the Last Supper. He says, For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. Paul is saying he saw this in a vision from Jesus. Now, if the story of the Last Supper, which is contained in all three Synoptic Gospels, was already in circulation and well known in the Christian community to whom Paul was writing, why would Paul claim that he saw the Last Supper in a vision and that he was the one who originated the story and had passed it on to the church? I don't think that makes any sense. I think that's a perfect example of using Wallace's own reasoning against him. Why would Paul make that reference, and why would Paul claim to be the originator or the first source of the Last Supper story if it was in the Gospels, and the Gospels were already written and in wide circulation at the time of his writing? Finally, some skeptics claim that Luke used Josephus as a source, which would mean that the Gospel of Luke couldn't have been written nearly as early as Wallace suggests. Well, personally, I'm less interested in the possibility of Luke using Josephus as a source, and much more interested in the probability that Luke used Mark as a source, a fact which doesn't seem to move Wallace at all. You know, a substantial portion of Luke seems lifted from Mark, and it's as though Wallace is saying, oh yeah, well, Luke's just quoting Mark. That just proves how reliable Mark must be, because Luke was a careful historian. So, is that why Luke, the careful historian, includes such absurd details as John the Baptist leaping in his mother's womb when the pregnant Mary was nearby? Is that why Luke, the careful historian, also includes events for which there is no historical evidence, like a census that required people to return to their ancestral homes? Oh, and if Luke was such a careful historian, why does he make no mention whatsoever of the dead rising from their graves en masse and walking around Jerusalem after the death of Jesus, which is mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew and only in the Gospel of Matthew? In fact, does the fact that the other Gospels and in the rest of the New Testament makes no reference to the saints of Jerusalem rising from their graves and walking around and appearing to many after the death of Jesus on the cross, does that not indicate that that probably didn't happen? Because surely a zombie apocalypse in Jerusalem after the crucifixion of Jesus would be a noteworthy historical event. Perhaps not siege of Jerusalem, fall of the temple noteworthy, but still definitely something to remember. And the fact that it's not mentioned anywhere other than one reference in the book of Matthew, doesn't that suggest, again, by Wallace's own reasoning, that that probably didn't happen? I ask you, I put it to you, am I completely off base here? Or does Wallace's own logic of saying that a major event not mentioned in the text means that either the text was written before that, which the text of Matthew couldn't have been written before the crucifixion of Jesus because it mentions the crucifixion of Jesus, so it must mean that that event just didn't happen, right? Anyway, in conclusion, Wallace has this to say, quote, "The inference that the Gospels were written in the first century prior to the destruction of the temple and during the lifetime of those who claimed to see Jesus is the best explanation. The explanation is feasible, straightforward, and logical. It exhausts all the evidence we have assembled, and it is superior to the alternative explanation." Well, it exhausts all the evidence that Wallace has assembled, as Wallace characterizes and interprets it, but in order to accept what Wallace has written here as the most plausible explanation of who wrote the New Testament and when they wrote it, you have to essentially ignore or at least substantially minimize the evidence presented by the majority of biblical scholars and critics, most of whom have been Christians since the early 19th century. As I mentioned in an earlier episode of this series, these forms of biblical criticism that Wallace is sort of rejecting are not new. This isn't a recent fad. You can't chalk this up to postmodernism or the cynicism of the age. This is something that started 200 years ago. Things like the documentary hypothesis and form criticism and the two-source hypothesis. This is not recent findings. This is 200 years of biblical scholarship. Wallace offers two possible explanations at the end of the chapter. Either the Gospels were written during the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses to Jesus by the traditionally attributed authors, or the Gospels were written decades later after the eyewitnesses were dead. But that's not the choice that he's really asking us to make. The choice he's really asking us to make is this: will we trust the last 200 years of biblical scholarship and criticism, or will we trust the traditional view, which the last 200 years of scholarship and criticism has demolished? Now, I'm a layperson. I am neither a scholar nor a theologian, nor a very well-informed Bible critic, but I know as just a person who relies on the expertise of others to form my opinions about these sorts of things, I think it's much more reasonable to go with the overwhelming modern biblical scholarly and critical consensus and say that what Wallace is saying is essentially an exploded hypothesis. That's not the way it happened. That's the way people used to think it happened. That's the way people used to think the New Testament originated before they knew better. Well, that's it for that chapter. That's it for this video. I will be back in the next video in this series to cover chapter 12, which is titled, "Were They Corroborated?" We continue to build the circumstantial case for the authenticity of the Gospels. How exciting. Thank you folks, as always, for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment, argue with me, agree with me, tell me if I got something right or if I got something wrong, whether you are an atheist or a Christian or some other category of belief or non-belief, whatever you are, whatever you have to say, I'm interested in your response to what I've had to say here. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. Subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already, and also please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron as little as $1 a month. Really helps me out. If you can afford to give any more than that and you think I'm worth more than that, that helps me out even more. I truly appreciate it. The next milestone goal in my Patreon campaign is a brand new high-quality audio podcast version of the An Atheist Reads series. So if you enjoy this and you would prefer to listen to it in a different format, listen to it on the go where you don't have to load a video just to listen to it, consider that. That's the upcoming goal in the Patreon campaign. So thank you all for your support. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time.